today is, why does political power alternate? I'm going to suffer from Roger's problem and stalk around, so I should use this. All right, so the feature, a general and a kind of well-regarded feature of democracy is that government turns over. We have power alternate between major parties or major politicians. And so the question I'm going to ask today is why that's the case. And it's not obvious because changing government is costly. All right, so there's fixed logistical costs of changing the identity of government and changing policies and these sorts of things. There's also uncertainty over electoral outcomes, and that uncertainty can depress investment and affect the economy. All right, and perhaps the most pernicious problem is this time inconsistency problem that's been shown in the literature quite frequently. So the idea is that early incumbents can abuse fiscal policy and run up big debts that's socially inefficient. All right, so the turning over of government creates this kind of inefficiency. All right, so the classic explanation of why we alternate power is that it's not the event of changing power that's important, it's the threat of changing power. All right, so the threat of losing government disciplines the behaviour of the incumbent, and that leads to more efficient policy choices. All right, so under this interpretation, and it's a good explanation, is that the transition of power represents a policy failure, and we want to do it as infrequently as possible. We want the incumbent to behave themselves, and we don't want to have to throw them out of office. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to offer a complementary explanation for why power alternates. And the explanation I'm going to offer, all right, shows why alternating power is by itself a benefit for voters. It's actually a good thing to change government, and so therefore may explain at least a little bit why we see changes in government so frequently. All right. So the benefit I'm going to document occurs when our knowledge of the policy mapping is incomplete. So when we have uncertainty about which policies map into which outcomes, all right, and it's going to occur for certain types of policy issues. So it's not going to happen for all policy issues. So I'm going to give you a measure of the complexity of a policy issue, and I'm going to find this benefit of alternating power appears when the issue is moderately complex. All right, so this is actually going to imply that we have a kind of non-monotonicity in the utility voters get from issues, in that they want these moderately complex issues, because this allows them to benefit from alternating power. All right, so the features of the model, just to give you a quick idea of the kind of logic we're going to go through, is that there's not going to be, in contrast to most kind of standard papers in the literature, is there's not going to be a real state variable here. All right, so there's no budget deficit, there's no running up of fiscal problems that ties the hand of the successor. All right, so there's not going to be any tying of hands in this model. All right, instead what's going to happen is there's going to be, because we don't understand the policy mapping perfectly, there's going to be the ability to strategically experiment with policy. All right, and this informational benefit or the informational externality of experimenting is what's going to create a linkage across periods. All right, so you can't tie the hands of your successor, but you can change the information your successor has. You can understand how they understand the policy mapping, how they understand the policy process, and that's going to affect the policy choice of your successor. All right, so there's not going to be any real connection, real kind of state variable connection across periods. It's going to be purely informational. All right, so what I'm going to show is that this informational kind of linkage across periods, all right, isn't going to make the time inconsistency problem go away. There's still very much going to be time inconsistency in alternating power. But in this setting, the time inconsistency is going to work to the benefit of the voters. All right, the kind of standard time inconsistency with budget deficits is that this is bad for voters and it's bad for everyone. All right, what I'm going to show, when we have an informational linkage across period, the time inconsistency is actually good for voters. All right, in a sense, you know. All right, given that you've got to have politicians choose the policy, it's a good thing for them. All right, and in fact, I'm going to show that alternating power in this uncertain environment, not only is it good to alternate power when we don't know the mapping, but this is going to leave voters better off than if they knew the mapping completely. All right, so having uncertainty over the policy mapping, whilst it's kind of, you might think it's a bad thing, alternating power in this setting leaves voters better off than if everyone knew the mapping completely. All right. So Renee said this conference is about the question of why do poor policies persist in the presence of good institutions. All right. We've got several explanations that have been given so far in the conference. I'm going to offer a somewhat of a different one. And the explanation I'm going to offer is information. All right, so information and path-dependent learning, all right, is going to capture the idea that we don't know what good policies are, and it's sometimes difficult to find them. All right, so this paper is part of a set of papers I've been working on, and some of you have seen the other papers, all right, trying to capture the idea that policy making is difficult, all right, and it's difficult to find good policies, and it's difficult to learn about what we should be doing. All right, I was kind of struck listening to the panel discussion earlier today when the panelists were talking about how Jamaica was doing well up until the 70s, and the government that came in at the time, their motto was, we can do better. All right, well, it turned out they couldn't do better, and they could actually do worse. They actually ended up doing worse. All right, so in a sense, they perhaps, I think, they may have sincerely thought they could do better, but this is a hard problem. All right, so I'm trying to develop some models or techniques to capture the fact that this is a hard problem to learn about policy, and to try to explain why they make mistakes and why these mistakes might persist. All right. So it's too late in the day to go through the related literature. I'm afraid I might lose more of you if I do that. So I'll skip right ahead and I'll kind of point out at the appropriate places where this fits in with other papers. All right, so I'm going to have a policy space and an outcome space, and both of these are going to be the set of integers. So we're going to have a discrete policy space and a discrete outcome space. All right, there's going to be 2 periods of policy making where the choice in each period is P1 and P2, and each of these is selected from the set of integers. All right, so there's no tying of hands, no real variable here. All right, the policy space in the second period is exactly the same as the first period, and it's independent of what the first period guy does. The actors are going to be a Democrat, a Republican, and a representative voter, and they have preferences over outcomes. So the Democrats' ideal outcome is negative gamma, the Republicans is positive gamma, and the representative voter is at 0. All right, so the idea here is, standard idea, we have a representative voter kind of flanked by ideological parties on either side, all right, and they've got to try to achieve good policy outcomes. All right, so all actors have quadratic loss preferences over the outcomes, and there's no discounting. All right, so they're going to have forward-looking preferences. They care about what happens in both periods, but I'm just avoiding the discounting issue here. Over 2 periods, it doesn't really matter. All right, so the challenge here is that everybody cares about outcomes, but you have to choose policies. All right, so I need to explain how policies are mapped into outcomes. And so I'm going to say there's a function psi that maps from the policy space to the outcome space, and I'm going to represent this function as a random walk. All right, in fact, I'm going to represent it as a discrete random walk of step size 1, where the probability of stepping up at between any 2 policies is q, where without loss of generality, that's greater than 1/2. All right, so some of you have seen me present other papers using this random walk framework. In the past, I've used a continuous random walk, a Brownian motion. Here, I'm going to use a discrete random walk, all right, for most of the results. All right, it turns out it's easier to calculate for certain behaviors. All right, so this function, whilst it's kind of randomly generated, it's in place. Nature draws this before the beginning of the first period. It's there. All right, so it's a function that maps policies to outcomes. The actors just don't know what the realized path of that function is. They do know that it was generated as a random walk, so they understand the set or the class of functions this one was chosen from. Right? But they don't know the realized path.